Okay, this is Endocrine System Part 2, Dr. Meade. This is Kim Foglia's point. We left off talking about the steroid hormones and how they enter the cell membrane. This is a steroid hormone. In this example, we were talking about testosterone being on a little protein carrier, and because it's a lipid hormone, it easily crosses the cell membrane, being on its easily carried across the membrane. And in this vessel, crossing into the nucleus, and it becomes a transcription factor, and because it's a transcription factor, it rapidly causes transcription, causing messenger RNA. This is just a quick review of what we left off with in the last video. So messenger RNA is quickly produced, and that causes a protein to be formed. And since we're talking about testosterone as our example, in this case, if testosterone was massively being produced, we'd be talking about, so some aspect of puberty would be being produced, so the proteins of puberty. Okay. Next slide. There we go. So there's blood, there's our steroid hormone, our target cells, the plasma membrane, the cytoplasm, nucleus, and crossing the cell membrane. There we go. So you should be able to use this slide as a practice to make sure you understand the steps of how a lipid hormone crosses the cell membrane, binds to DNA to be a transcription factor, and causes a protein to be formed and then released. Okay, and so here we go. This is exactly out of your textbook. So the action of a protein hormone, which is different than the steroid hormone. So they cannot cross the cell membrane, so they're going to sit in a little receptor and cause a conformational change in a hormone. We talked about in chapter 11 cell signaling, so here's our big purple receptor, and it's causing a conformational change. And so here's our protein hormone, step 1, signal, binds to the receptor protein, the big purple thing, activates a cytoplasmic signal, GTP. You remember this. Activates a G protein, which activates an enzyme, and you remember the G protein signaling, which causes, which releases ATP and then causes a cascade effect. So cyclic AMP acts as a secondary messenger, activates enzyme, which activates another enzyme, and that's called transduction. So remember, we have a signal, and then step 2 is transduction of the signal, the secondary messenger system, and it produces an action. So step 3 is the response. So if you don't remember this from our cell signaling chapter, this would be a great review. So try this whole thing again without all these labels and try to label them as a review for our AP exam. All right, so epinephrine, we've been talking a little bit about epinephrine. You knew it as adrenaline before. We now know adrenaline is not a real word. Epinephrine is the actual term. So, okay, so in this example, we're talking about a liver cell. So here's the cell membrane of a liver cell. The receptor protein here. Okay, so I had to pause for a second, so I lost where I was, but we're talking about a liver cell and epinephrine, which is part of your fight or flight reaction. So epinephrine is not a steroid, a lipid hormone, so it does not enter. So as you see, we have a little receptor sitting in the cell membrane, and so it's going to have a signal that sits there. And here we go. Oh, there we go. So epinephrine comes in and locks into the receptor sitting in the cell membrane. That's our signal. Then it activates GTP. So GTP, which causes a GDP reaction, activates the G protein. So step 3 is going to be that it activates adenyl cyclase, which is something we haven't really talked about yet, but is unique to this chemical reaction, which gets ATP involved and stimulates cyclic AMP, which we have talked about many times, which you know is going to cause a kinase to become involved. And I want you to ask yourself right now, when is a kinase involved in a reaction? So that's the big $1,000,000 question about watching this video, and I want you to come to class tomorrow and be able to tell me what kinases are involved in for reactions. Okay? Oh, kind of gives it away there, doesn't it? So it activates a phosphorylase. Okay? So we're talking about phosphorylation reactions, which means that anytime we're going to phosphorylate, it means we're going to create some unstable phosphates attached to things so that we can have high energy reactions. So this is when we're transducing the signal. So here's the signal, epinephrine, and since epinephrine can't really enter the liver cell, we are going to transmit that signal by passing it along using GDP, and then we're going to transduce that signal using cyclic AMP and a bunch of phosphorylated enzymes right here. Okay, step 6 here is a glycogen reaction with glucose. So this is unique to the liver cell. So glycogen, okay, becomes glucose and released to the blood. So when epinephrine sends a signal to the liver cell, we end up with a lot of extra glucose released to the blood. Why would we, if we were in a fight or flight state, want a whole bunch of extra sugar released in our blood? Okay, so epinephrine gets released, it goes to your liver releases a bunch of sugar, sugar gets released to your blood, and then you get to have a whole bunch of extra energy everywhere. So as you might imagine, that unless you restore your sugar, that whole cycle is not going to last for very long. Okay, so that's the response there. Okay, so the benefits of a secondary messenger system. In other words, this idea of having a signal that lands on a receptor protein. All right, so we have this idea of a signal landing, and it doesn't go directly inside the cell, lands on a receptor protein. So what would be the advantage if you had to think about it? Well, here it is. It causes an amplification effect. So this tiny little signal that lands on a receptor protein causes, depending on the signal and the receptor protein, at times a really amplified effect. And we can have a tiny signal landing on a bunch of different, one signal causing an amplified effect on a bunch of different proteins at once. And so one signal can cause a very large effect. So we'll see this amplification in action right here. Okay, so it causes cascade multipliers. So one signal is causing a huge effect. So epinephrine, something which we talked about can be injected if you're like allergic to bees and you need, you know, an epi-stat, like they say on TV, where they shoot you with epi. They quickly give you epi, and this one little signal causes this huge amplification effect in one cell. And so that's why something like epinephrine can save your life. Okay, it causes a wicked fast response. Okay, so that's how something like that maintains homeostasis. Okay, so hormone 1, we're talking about a gland. Hormone 1 lowers body condition. If something is low, we have a gland. Oopsie. And hormone 2 then raises the body condition. And this is a negative feedback mode. Okay. Controlling body temperature, which we've talked about offhand all year long about homeostasis. This involves the hypothalamus, as I've told you. So if somebody has a disease in their hypothalamus, they may have trouble maintaining a body temperature. Or if you have a fever, your hypothalamus is the one that controls that from going too high. Okay, you get a nerve signal, and or in this case, if you're exercising, you get the signal and your body releases sweat so that you don't become too high a body temperature and your body returns to a normal state of 37 degrees Celsius. Okay, so you have dilated blood vessels that release sweat. If your body temperature becomes too low, the hypothalamus becomes involved, and releases a signal. This is in your brain, of course, and nerve signals become involved, and you shiver to increase warmth. So it causes a constriction of vessels and increases warmth. For regulation of blood sugar, which is also involved with hormones, here's your pancreas, okay, which is located right here, just under and behind your stomach. Your pancreas releases insulin. All right, it has islets of Langerhans and beta islet cells in it that the body cells take up sugar from blood. Okay, your liver stores glycogen. Okay, it reduces appetite. So when your blood sugar is very high, your pancreas gets involved to bring it back down to normal. When your blood sugar is low, your pancreas becomes involved. Okay, and then glucagon becomes involved. And the alpha cells this time, and again the islets of Langerhans, and the liver releases glucose to raise the blood sugar, and it triggers hunger so that you eat. Oops, I should back up a second. All right, so this cycle right here is a critical cycle to understand, because if we're going to talk about the diseases such as diabetes, when this cycle no longer functions, we need to understand what it's supposed to look like when it's normal. And this is something, since we're reducing the AP to these three main body systems, they would expect you to understand this cycle very, very well. When we look at the fetal pigs, you'll be able to see the pancreas pretty well, although it's so tiny it's easy to destroy, so we'll make sure we see it. And I would make sure you take a look at what the anatomy looks like in your book. Okay, so for blood osmolarity, okay, your blood pressure. How do we maintain blood pressure? So, blood pressure is high. So again, we're talking about the hypothalamus in the brain. It has osmoreceptors to notice when blood pressure is high. Okay, and this is showing us the region of the brain we're talking about. So the pituitary gland is also involved to notice this. So then we release ADH, which I told you about, the vasopressin, the antidiuretic hormone, promoting increased water reabsorption by the kidneys. So the nephrons are inside the kidneys. Okay, so this is going to increase thirst so that we increase our water consumption to increase the water uptake there, increase water reabsorption. When blood pressure is low, the nephrons are going to become directly absorbed. The JGA, juxtaglomerular apparatus, which is very hard to say, is right there in the kidneys, okay, and renin. And here's the hormone, angiotensinogen, which releases angiotensin. And here's where your adrenal gland sits, right on top of your kidneys. And you can see that it looks a lot like the pancreas and the other glands of the endocrine system. And releases aldosterone, which increases salt reabsorption, which is going to increase the blood pressure. So if our blood pressure is high, we're going to need ADH to increase water reabsorption so that we can decrease our blood pressure. Blood pressure is low, ultimately we're going to need angiotensin and aldosterone to increase salt reabsorption to increase the blood pressure. So try to get to the kind of the big picture hormones here that control this. Okay, let's try to put together just one more big picture before we end this segment. Okay, you're starting to see that a lot of this comes back to hypothalamus, this little center of the brain here. So the brain. And this is what's bringing together the nervous and endocrine system and why we're teaching them together. So the nervous system receives information from nerves around the body about internal conditions, because the reason we're teaching 3 main systems of the body this year is because of how they relate to hormones. So when we receive information, we're going to release hormones to regulate the body. The pituitary gland is the master gland that is going to secrete the main hormones that trigger cascades of the other hormones class. So the pituitary gland is the master gland of the endocrine system. It secretes a broad range of tropic hormones that regulate all the other glands in the body. All right, so this is the chart we're going to simplify, and I'm going to, and then we'll end this part of the video, and then we have one more part after this. All right, and as you can see by looking at these pictures, how these glands all look different than the organs of the other parts of the body. So tropic hormones mean target and glands. So here's the hypothalamus. So this is the nervous system part. See, posterior and anterior pituitary glands of the brain. So here's your thyroid in your throat. Your thyroid stimulating hormone, TSH, is your thyroid gland is sitting in your throat. Okay, your thyroid gland secretes thyroid stimulating hormone, and thyroid stimulating hormone. Then your adrenocorticotropic hormone is from your adrenal cortex. Then growth hormone, which comes from bone and muscle. Gonadotropic hormones, which we already talked about, which are follicle stimulating hormones, FSH, and luteinizing hormones, LH. Come on, ovaries. And then prolactin, which I don't think we talked about, PRL, which is in the mammary glands in mammals, which secretes milk, which is also partly responsible for the bonding feeling after birth for mammals. Melanocyte secreting hormone,